I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who cheats. Growing up in a small town where everyone knows everyone's business, I'd seen enough affairs and their aftermath to know better. But life has a way of surprising you, of leading you down paths you never thought you'd take. My name is Emma Thompson, and this is the story of how I fell in love with my husband's cousin. Jack and I met in high school. He was the quiet type who spent his weekends fixing up old cars, while I waited tables at my parents' diner. We weren't the most exciting couple, but we were happy enough. After graduation, Jack got a job at the local factory, and I kept working at the diner. We got married when I was 20, just like everyone expected us to. Life was simple, predictable. Jack worked his shifts at the factory, often pulling doubles to make extra money. I worked mornings at the diner, came home to clean our small rental house, and watched TV alone most nights. It wasn't perfect, but it was our life. Then Ryan Matthews moved to town. I remember the first time I saw him. It was at a family barbecue at Jack's parents' place. Ryan had just divorced his wife of 5 years and moved from Chicago to our small town in Pennsylvania. He'd taken a job at Mike's Auto Repair, determined to start fresh. "Emma," Jack called me over, "come meet my cousin Ryan." When our eyes met, something shifted in the air. Ryan was different from the men I knew. He had an edge to him, a hint of the city in his manner. His blue eyes held mine a moment too long as we shook hands. "Nice to meet you, Emma," he said, and something in his voice made my cheeks warm. That evening, as families gathered around plastic tables in the backyard, Ryan and I ended up talking. He told me about Chicago, about his failed marriage to a woman who decided she wasn't ready for the settling down life. I told him about the diner, about my dreams of maybe going to community college someday. "Why don't you?" he asked. I shrugged. "Jack thinks it's a waste of money, says we need to save for a house instead." Something flickered in Ryan's eyes. "And what do you think?" No one had asked me that in a long time. Over the next few weeks, Ryan became a regular at the diner. He'd come in during my shifts, order coffee and eggs, and we'd talk during my breaks. He told me about places he'd been, things he'd seen. His stories made our small town feel even smaller. Jack didn't seem to notice anything different. He was working more hours than ever, trying to save for that house he wanted. Most nights, he'd come home exhausted, eat the dinner I'd left in the microwave, and fall asleep in front of the TV. We barely talked anymore, unless it was about bills or household repairs. The annual Thompson family camping trip in late August changed everything. It was tradition, 3 days at Cherry Creek State Park. All the cousins and their families, packed into various tents and RVs. Jack couldn't get Friday off work, so he planned to join us Saturday morning. "Ryan can drive you up," his mother suggested. "He's going early too." The 2-hour drive with Ryan was filled with conversation and laughter. We talked about everything: music, movies, our hopes and fears. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. At the campsite, we set up tents in the fading daylight. The other families wouldn't arrive until later that evening. As we worked, storm clouds gathered overhead. "Looks like rain," Ryan said, glancing up. "We should get everything covered." We barely finished securing the tarps when the sky opened up. Lightning flashed, followed by booming thunder that made me jump. We ran for the nearest shelter, Ryan's tent. Inside, we sat listening to the rain pound against the canvas. Water dripped through a small leak, forming a puddle between us. I reached out to move our bags away from the water, and our hands brushed. The touch sent electricity through my body. When I looked up, Ryan was staring at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Neither of us spoke. The air felt thick with tension and possibility. "Emma," he whispered, and then his lips were on mine. I should have pushed him away. I should have thought about Jack, about family, about consequences. Instead, I kissed him back with all the passion I'd been holding inside for years. His hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer. The storm raged outside, but I barely heard it over the sound of my own heartbeat. What happened next still plays in my mind like a fever dream. Clothes were shed, boundaries crossed. Every touch felt like fire on my skin. Ryan kissed me like a man starved, his hands exploring every inch of me. I'd never felt so desired, so alive. Afterward, we lay tangled in sleeping bags, the guilt already starting to creep in. But when Ryan pulled me closer and whispered, "I've wanted to do that since the day I met you," I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The rest of the camping trip was torture. When Jack arrived the next morning, I could barely look him in the eye. Every time Ryan and I were near each other, the air crackled with unspoken tension. We stole glances across the campfire, found excuses to brush against each other when passing by. Each secret moment made my heart race with both excitement and fear. Back home, I tried to forget what happened. I threw myself into being a better wife, cooking Jack's favorite meals, keeping the house spotless, initiating sex for the first time in months. But Jack was too tired most nights, or too focused on overtime opportunities at the factory. Ryan started coming to the diner more often. He'd sit in my section, order his usual, and we'd exchange loaded looks that said everything we couldn't say out loud. One rainy Tuesday, he left a note with his tip, "Meet me at the old miller's warehouse after your shift." I knew I shouldn't go. But at 3 p.m., I found myself pulling into the abandoned parking lot behind the warehouse. Ryan was waiting in his truck. The moment I got in, he pulled me into a desperate kiss. "I can't stop thinking about you," he breathed against my lips, "about that night in the tent." "We can't," I whispered, even as my hands clutched at his shirt. "Jack doesn't appreciate what he has," Ryan finished. "I see how he treats you, Emma. You deserve more." That afternoon in his truck became the first of many secret meetings. We'd meet wherever we could, the warehouse, remote hiking trails, sometimes even in his apartment above the auto shop when we were feeling particularly reckless. Each time I told myself it would be the last. Each time I went back for more. Ryan was everything Jack wasn't. He listened when I talked about my dreams. He touched me like I was precious, desired. When I mentioned wanting to take classes at the community college, he helped me look up programs and schedules. "You should do it," he said one afternoon as we lay in his bed. "Don't let anyone hold you back." Jack would never understand. I sighed. He thinks education is a waste unless it leads directly to more money. Ryan traced patterns on my bare shoulder. "You're not happy with him, are you?" The question hung in the air. I'd been avoiding thinking about it, about what all this meant for my marriage. "It's not that simple." "It could be," Ryan said softly. "We could leave, start fresh somewhere else." The idea was both terrifying and tempting. "What about your job, the family?" "I'd give it all up for you," he said, and I knew he meant it. Autumn crept in, painting the town in shades of red and gold. Our affair continued, becoming more reckless with each passing week. We started taking bigger risks, lingering touches at family gatherings, meaningful glances across crowded rooms. The thrill of almost getting caught became part of the excitement. One Sunday afternoon, while Jack was watching football with his friends, I was in Ryan's apartment. We'd just made love, and I was wearing his shirt, making coffee in his tiny kitchen. The domesticity of the moment struck me, how natural it felt to be there with him. "Move in with me," Ryan said suddenly, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. I nearly dropped the coffee pot. "What?" "I'm serious, Emma. I love you. I think about you constantly. When you're not here, this place feels empty." My heart raced. "Ryan, I'm married to your cousin." "I know," he turned me to face him, "and I know it's messy and complicated, but I've never felt this way about anyone, not even my ex-wife. You're the first thing I think about when I wake up, and the last thing on my mind before I sleep." Tears welled in my eyes. "I love you too," I admitted for the first time, "but this would destroy Jack. It would tear the whole family apart." "Maybe they need to be torn apart," Ryan said. "This family, this town, they're all about appearances. Everyone's so worried about what everyone else thinks that they forget to live their own lives." He wasn't wrong. I'd seen it my whole life. People settling for less than they wanted because it was expected of them. I'd done the same thing when I married Jack. That night, when I went home, Jack was passed out on the couch, empty beer cans scattered around him. The football game was still playing on TV. I stood there looking at him, trying to remember when we'd last had a real conversation that wasn't about money or household chores. The next week, I enrolled in 2 night classes at the community college Introduction to Business and English Composition. I told Jack I'd picked up extra shifts at the diner. He barely looked up from his phone when I told him. Ryan helped me buy my textbooks. "I'm proud of you," he said, kissing me in the college parking lot after my first class. "You're taking control of your life." But guilt was eating away at me. Every time Jack's mother called to invite us to dinner, every time I sat across from him at our kitchen table, every time he absent-mindedly kissed my cheek before work, it felt like a knife in my heart. Everything fell apart on a cold November morning. I was at the diner, working my usual shift, when Jack's sister Sarah came in. She wasn't alone. She had screenshots of text messages between Ryan and me on her phone. Someone had seen us outside the college and started paying attention. "How could you?" Sarah hissed, sliding into my section. He's my brother's wife, for God's sake. My world stopped spinning. The coffee pot in my hand trembled. Sarah, save it. She cut me off. You have until tonight to tell Jack, or I will. I spent the rest of my shift in a daze, nearly dropping plates and mixing up orders. When my manager asked if I was okay, I blamed it on a migraine and left early. I drove straight to Ryan's apartment. He opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside. They know, I sobbed into his chest. Sarah knows. She's going to tell Jack if I don't. Ryan held me tighter. Maybe this is for the best. No more hiding, no more lies. For the best? I pulled away, suddenly angry. This is going to destroy everything. Jack will never forgive either of us. Your aunt and uncle will hate me. The whole town will talk. Then let's leave, Ryan said urgently. Right now. We can pack what we need and be gone before anyone knows. I've got savings. We could start over somewhere new. For a moment, I was tempted, so tempted. But reality crashed in. I can't just disappear. I need to face this. That evening, I waited for Jack in our living room. When he came home from his shift, covered in factory grime and looking exhausted, my heart nearly broke. We need to talk, I said quietly. He must have heard something in my voice because he stopped, still wearing his work boots. What's wrong? I've been having an affair, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. With Ryan. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack stood there completely still, like he hadn't understood what I'd said. Ryan? He finally repeated. My cousin Ryan? I nodded, tears streaming down my face. How long? Since the camping trip. The rage that exploded from Jack was like nothing I'd ever seen before. He kicked over our coffee table, sending magazines and decorative bowls flying. His face turned red as he screamed questions at me. How could I do this? Was I sleeping with Ryan every time I said I was working late? Did I ever love him at all? I stood there taking it all, knowing I deserved every bit of his anger. When he finally collapsed onto the couch, head in his hands, his voice was barely a whisper. Get out, he said. Just get out. I packed a small bag with shaking hands. As I reached for the door, Jack spoke again. Was it worth it? He asked, not looking at me. Destroying our marriage? Breaking up the family? I couldn't answer. Instead, I walked out into the cold November night. I drove to a motel on the edge of town, not ready to face Ryan yet. My phone was exploding with messages. Sarah had already spread the word. Jack's mother left a voicemail calling me every name in the book. My own mother texted that she was disappointed beyond words. Around midnight, Ryan called. Jack showed up at my place, he said. Broke my nose and 2 of my ribs before the neighbors called the cops. My stomach lurched. Oh God, are you okay? I'll live, Emma. I meant what I said before. Let's leave. There's nothing left for either of us here now. I stared at the stained motel ceiling. I need time, Ryan. Everything's happening so fast. He was quiet for a moment. I understand, but don't take too long. I love you and I want a life with you. Away from all this small-town drama and judgment. The next few weeks were a blur. I stayed with a friend from the diner while divorce papers were drawn up. Jack refused to see me, communicating only through his lawyer. The town split into camps, those who sympathized with Jack and thought I was a homewrecker, and those who understood that marriages sometimes fail. Ryan kept his distance, respecting my need for space, but he texted every day, telling me he loved me, that he'd wait for me to be ready. 1 month after everything exploded, I sat in my car outside the community college. I'd just finished my final exam for the semester. Despite everything, I'd managed to pass both classes. I pulled out my phone and called Ryan. I'm ready, I said when he answered. If you still want to leave, I'm ready. His response was immediate. Meet me at my place in an hour. We packed his truck that night, taking only what we needed. As the sun rose, we drove past the "Thank you for visiting" sign at the town limits. I didn't look back. We ended up in Colorado in a small city near Denver. Ryan found work at a local auto shop and I enrolled full-time in business school. We rented a tiny apartment with a view of the mountains and slowly began building a new life together. The scandal back home eventually died down. Jack remarried a year later to a girl he met at church. When I heard the news, I felt nothing but relief that he had found happiness again, relief that I was no longer the town's favorite topic of gossip. Ryan's parents came around first, visiting us that Christmas. They saw how happy we were together, how we'd built something real from the ashes of what we'd destroyed. Gradually, other family members followed. Some relationships were permanently damaged, but others proved stronger than we'd expected. 5 years later, I sat on our back porch, watching Ryan play with our 3-year-old daughter in the yard. My business degree had led to a successful career managing a chain of boutiques. Ryan had opened his own auto repair shop. We were happy, genuinely, deeply happy. "Any regrets?" Ryan asked that night as we lay in bed. I thought about it. "I regret the way we started," I said honestly. "I regret hurting Jack, hurting the family, but I don't regret where we ended up." He pulled me closer. "Me neither." The affair that started in a storm-battered tent had burned down everything we knew. But from those ashes, we'd built something beautiful, something real. It wasn't the way either of us had planned to find happiness, but sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its biggest mistakes. I still think about that summer sometimes, about the choices we made and the price we paid for them. I think about the girl I was then, trapped in a loveless marriage, afraid to want more from life. She seems like a stranger now. They say that time heals all wounds. What they don't say is that sometimes the healing leaves you stronger in the broken places. Ryan and I carry our scars, but they're proof that we survived, that we chose love even when it meant walking through fire. And in the end, that's what matters most, not how the story began, but how it ends.